Good morning. Morning and welcome to today's program, Building a Balanced, Sustainable Economy in North America and Around the World, a conversation with Thomas Mulcair. And greetings to those of you watching on the webcast and those of you who will be watching later on the filmed version. I'm David Biet. I'm director of the Canada Institute here at the Woodrow Wilson Centre. The Canada Institute works to increase awareness and knowledge about Canada and Canada-U.S. relations among U.S. policymakers and opinion leaders. We focus our work in primarily three areas: energy and environment, trade, and border security. I'd like to give some background on the Center for those of you who aren't familiar with the Wilson Center. The Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars was founded in 1968 by an act of Congress as the official memorial to the 28th president, our only president with a PhD. At the center, we build a bridge between the worlds of academia, business, and public policy by fostering independent research, open dialogue, and actionable ideas as we tackle the nation's problems and challenges. In the last few weeks, we've looked at hydropower partnerships between Canada and the United States, and we're very lucky to have Manitoba Premier Greg Selinger here with us to address the issue. And last week, we had several panels of experts on energy and environment discuss energy infrastructure in Canada and the United States. And we're pleased to welcome Saskatchewan Premier Brad Wall. The Wilson Centre and the Canada Institute are honored to welcome Canada's leader of the official opposition and the leader of Canada's new Democratic Party. We're also very happy to have with us four members of Parliament: Paul Dewar, Hélène Laverdière, David Christopherson, and Dennis Bevington. Welcome to the Wilson Centre. And now I'd like to introduce Paul Fraser, who is president of P.D. Fraser Consulting here in Washington and co-chair of the Canada Institute's Advisory Board. Paul will serve as moderator of today's program. Paul is an experienced government relations professional here in Washington and has extensive experience in the Canadian Foreign Service and served as Canada's ambassador to the Czech Republic and Slovakia. A little bit of housekeeping. Today's program is being webcast live. The webcast will be posted later. Please wait for the microphone before speaking and identify yourself and your affiliation. And with respect to media people, hold your questions. We'd like to have media questions after the program and let the audience here ask the questions as they will. And Paul, I guess that's it. Let me turn the program over to you.
Thank you very much, David. I'll be very, very brief about the background of our special guest this morning. You've all had access to that information. What is important, I think, is that we're very proud to have Mr. Mulcair with us today as the leader of Canada's official opposition. As David has just mentioned, we pride ourselves in being a destination for a wide range of prominent leaders in political life and public life in Canada and in the United States. And we are honored today by Mr. Mulcair's visit. This is a city that prides itself, maybe more so than other places, in active debate and discussion of all sorts of issues. And we don't always agree, as we all know, but the views are out there, and they're there for further discussion and for learning. And that's very much what this forum is about today and the series that we hold on a regular basis. It's also a place that, in long tradition, leaders of Canada's official opposition have visited over many, many years. And as, in essence, given the nature of the position as possible prime ministers, I think it's extremely important that all of us who take an interest not only in Canada but in the vast relationship of Canada-U.S. Daily activities, that we have this opportunity to meet and hear from Mr. Mulcair. So with that having been said, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Mr. Mulcair.
Merci beaucoup, Paul, de cette présentation si gentille. Et merci à vous tous d'être ici avec nous aujourd'hui. C'est une journée absolument merveilleuse ici à Washington. Or, as we'd say in Canada's other official language, good morning, eh? It's an honor to be here with you today to discuss how our two countries can work together to build a balanced, sustainable North American economy in the 21st century. There could be no better or no timely venue for this discussion than this centre, the Woodrow Wilson Centre. As you know, this month marks the 100th anniversary of Woodrow Wilson's inauguration as president. Everyone remembers Woodrow Wilson's role in creating the League of Nations, but this week also marks the 100th anniversary of his second best-known creation, the Presidential Press Conference. Before Wilson, journalists had never been allowed to grill such a powerful political figure in such a structured, sustained, and public manner. Elected officials such as myself, of course, have been taking Woodrow Wilson's name in vain ever since. But just imagine what things would have been like if the man had ever heard about Twitter. While the members of the media who are here with us today may see Wilson's commitment to open government as his most lasting legacy, the fact is that for the last 100 years, Woodrow Wilson's ideas have shaped the world's approach to foreign policy in even more profound ways. Wilson challenged the idea that a country's foreign policy be based solely on the pursuit of its immediate self-interest. He believed that governments should project their nation's values onto the world stage. These approaches have long been respectively labeled the realist and idealist schools of foreign policy, but those terms are starting to show their age. Today, on the world stage, our most fundamental values intersect. They're intertwined with our most fundamental interests: peace and security, prosperity and social justice, democracy and good governance. These values have served as the foundation of the strength of our democratic world. These values guide us even now. 100 years ago, Wilson began to grapple with the growing interconnectedness of a new century. Today, we face a world more interconnected than ever. Economic boundaries have been all but erased. Information, along with money and resources, can cross borders without barriers. Threats that once seemed distant are now all too close to home. 100 years ago, Wilson believed governments should aim to project their nation's values on the world stage. Today, governments across the globe are realizing they have no other choice. In the 21st century, an idealistic foreign policy is a realistic foreign policy. Principle has become pragmatic. Nowhere has this connection between our values and our interests become more clear than in the fight to combat global climate change. Canadians are keenly aware of the threat global warming poses not only to our environment, but to our economy as well. The development of Canada's natural resources has become a matter of fierce debate within our own borders and beyond. The sustainability of our industries is already having a direct impact on their development. Projects that fail to uphold basic principles of sustainable development, like polluter pay, are being met with increasing hostility on all fronts. The European Union is considering action of its own to address the carbon intensity of fossil fuels. It's called the European Fuel Quality Directive. New Democrats believe that Canada's natural resources are, of course, a tremendous blessing. They can be a source of wealth and prosperity for our country for generations to come. But the future of Canada's natural resource sector will be based on our access to global markets. And Canada's access to global markets will be based, in turn, not only on the demand for our resources, but on the world's assessment of how we develop them. The question that faces us now is whether the development will be sustainable development. I believe that in the next century, that question will shape the world's community's global trade relationship more than any other. While using the air, the soil, and the water as an unlimited free dumping ground may be considered acceptable business practice for some, it is in fact an unfair trade advantage. In the global 21st century economy, there can simply be no excuse for failing to internalize environmental costs. And those who fail to recognize this reality will fail to thrive. In Canada, it was the New Democratic Party that first raised the issue of climate change in the House of Commons exactly 30 years ago in 1983. As Minister of the Environment and Sustainable Development in Quebec, I introduced North America's first comprehensive sustainable development law. I went so far as to propose, and it was adopted unanimously, the amendment of our province's Charter of Rights to include the right to live in a healthy and biodiverse environment. These are human rights. It's the rights of humans to continue to prosper on our planet. My predecessor as leader of the New Democratic Party, Jack Layton, pushed legislation through the House of Commons. It was adopted formally by our elected House of Commons to mandate binding carbon emission targets, a cap-and-trade plan across all Canadian industries. In an unprecedented move for an initiative of such importance, this bill, duly enacted by the House of Commons, was killed in Canada's unelected Senate. The Conservative Party used its majority in the Senate, which is unelected in Canada, to defeat the climate change bill. It's very similar to the groundbreaking climate change legislation that was killed in your Senate a few years ago. And though the end result, as I've just pointed out, may be the same, at least you can take solace in the fact that your Senate is elected. Ours act with even a mandate from voters. Last month, President Obama spoke eloquently in his State of the Union about the need to take real action in the fight against climate change. That is necessary for our children and for all of our futures. Contrast that with the fact that our government is the only government in the world to have withdrawn from the Kyoto Protocol. But what I can tell the millions of Americans who are committed to the fight against climate change is that there are millions of Canadians who stand with you. In Canada, leaders of all political parties acknowledge that climate change is real and must be addressed. The Canadian public supports basic principles like polluter pay at near universal levels, no matter what province you're in. Even industry leaders realize that they can no longer ignore these principles and still hope to profit. Forward-thinking business leaders know that their industries can only flourish when they have not only a regulatory, but also a social license as well. That means adhering to the basic principles of sustainable development. It means full, credible, and public consultations with communities impacted by natural resource development. Excuse me. And it means working in partnership with Canada's First Nations to ensure our resources are developed responsibly. It's difficult to perceive Canadian resource development as a sustainable endeavour when our government guts the very environmental assessments Canada relied on to ensure a basic level of sustainability. There's no more monitoring. They've gutted, for example, the Navigable Waters Protection Act, an important piece, a 100-year-old piece of environmental legislation, and when we pointed that out to them in the House of Commons, they protested. They said, well, no, it's about navigation. The website of the ministry responsible mentioned 30 times that it was important. Environmental legislation. We pointed to their own website. They changed the website as if that would change the law. To an unthinking investor, a regulatory blank check may seem like a windfall. Getting rid of all the environmental hurdles, what have you heard around the board table for so long? This is what's stopping us. This takes too long. This holds us up. Get rid of it. This government's doing just that. So those that are not thinking long-term are sort of saying to themselves, that's what we've always wanted. This must be good. But it's a poison chalice that they're accepting. In the wake of President Obama's State of the Union, your ambassador to Ottawa, David Jacobson, gave Canadians his own frank assessment. He said that American acceptance of projects like Keystone XL will only be moved by progress addressing the impact that development will have on issues like climate change. He's of course right. That's a warning that we have to take to heart. When it comes to our natural resource sector, our principles are pragmatic. And this lesson applies not only to the sustainability of our resources themselves, but to the investment policies that will guide their development as well. In the past 2 years alone, state-owned Chinese companies like PetroChina and CNOOC, that's the China National Offshore Oil Corporation, have invested more than $25 billion in the Canadian oil and gas sector. In fact, according to the Conference Board in Canada, by 2020, China will be Canada's second largest investor, largely in oil and gas. This presents an incredible opportunity and a significant challenge for both Canada and the United States alike. CNOOC's recent $15 billion takeover of the Canadian energy company Nexen paralleled a nearly identical takeover bid for an American oil and gas producer, Unocal, that was rejected by the United States in 2005. China has made it abundantly clear that it is adamant about expanding its access to the North American energy market. Of course, if done well, foreign direct investment from countries like China can be an enormous benefit to our energy sector. But managing that investment will require a coherent vision, one that encourages certainty for investors while protecting our national interests as well. From the environmental to the social to the economic, we always have to measure these against the backdrop of sustainable development. Canadian law requires that all foreign takeovers above a certain threshold meet what's called a net benefit test to protect Canadian interests. The trouble is, no one's quite sure exactly what net benefit means, and the terms and conditions that accompany foreign takeovers are usually kept secret. In 2010, an NDP motion unanimously passed the House of Commons calling for a clear definition of net benefit. one that would provide clarity to both Canadians and potential investors. Nothing, for having practiced corporate law for a long time, I can tell you that nothing an investor hates more than uncertainty. Clear rules are good for everyone. Yet after 2 years, our current government still has no respect for the will of Parliament. Concerns over foreign investment in Canada have only grown since our current government signed the new Canada-China Foreign Investment Promotion and Protection Agreement, an agreement known by the shorthand FIPA. This is an agreement negotiated by this current Conservative federal government in total secrecy, without any consultation with the Canadian public and with no debate in Parliament. It is intended to bind the hands of the Canadian government for the next 31 years. This is an affront to one of the basic tenets of the Westminster system of parliamentary democracy, that one parliament cannot bind the hands of future parliaments. Under Article 6 of the FIPA, once a Chinese company is established in Canada, it must receive, quote, national treatment for expansion and operations, meaning it must be treated as if it were any other Canadian company. This vital clause gives CNOOC, the Chinese National Offshore Oil Company I referred to earlier, powerful rights to expand its ownership in Canada's oil and gas sector and buy up as many new leases as it likes as any Canadian company would. Now, 30 years ago, we clarified that provinces have jurisdiction over natural resources, so you can see how this is not only an issue in terms of overall Canadian ownership and control of our natural resources, but it's actually going to play inherently into some very strong federalist angles as well, because the provinces will indeed be losing a certain part of their jurisdiction over natural resources as a result of this deal. China has finally ratified it. We are informed, it's not public, as of February 7th. We still have no news as to whether or not the Conservatives have ratified it. They denied the effect of it when we pointed it out to them. They're not trying to deny it anymore. I think it's finally become clear to them that they've made an incredible mistake. The treaty goes even further by providing China with a mechanism to sue our federal government if a Chinese company's right to expand its ownership of Canadian natural resources is blocked or impeded. Under the terms of the FIPA, these lawsuits would be launched in secret, in front of a binding international tribunal, and outside the rule of Canadian domestic law. Taken together, the FIPA and CNOOC's takeover of Nexen effectively limit the ability of Canadian governments to independently control our own natural resource policy while ceding enormous control over our resources to a foreign power. Let's not kid ourselves. In the case, this is not a state-owned enterprise. In the case of a communist country like China, it's China. It's a fig leaf to believe that there's any real difference between the two. Canada is no stranger, of course, as you can understand, to dealing with the challenges that arise when navigating a complex relationship with a major global power. But for decades, Canada and the United States have enjoyed a close economic relationship that, while not always perfect, has overwhelmingly served the interests of both sides. Despite our differences that arise from time to time, Canada and the United States are both societies based on the rule of law. We both enjoy modern, dynamic economies. We both respect fundamental labor, environmental, and human rights. These are shared values, and they are the strength upon which our economic relationship has been built. When it comes to our economic partnership, those shared principles have served pragmatic ends. And never has principled economic leadership been so needed on the world stage. President Wilson himself once observed, and I quote, "You cannot be a statesman and not a banker." That sentiment is even more true today than it was a century ago. In his State of the Union address last month, President Obama renewed his call for the elimination of corporate tax loopholes that allow the richest few to get out of paying their fair share. In Canada, New Democrats are pressuring our Conservative government to do the same. A February report by the OECD found that aggressive tax planning by multinational corporations is not only eroding the tax base of many countries, it's threatening the integrity of the entire international tax system. There are some companies, BP is a good example, operating in over 100 countries, a couple of hundred subsidiaries and affiliates of all nature. It's a monumental accounting shell game as things are moved from place to place, and more often than not, they wind up paying no taxes. Interestingly enough, the public seems to get most ignited when it's an example they can get immediately. And recently in Great Britain, it was the fact that it was revealed that Starbucks, despite the fact that they're on every street corner there as well, paid no taxes. And that caused an uproar. It's very interesting. They've offered to start paying some, even though they had managed to avoid it otherwise. The British, to stay with that theme, there's a group that you should know about in Britain called the Tax Justice Network. Very serious people, senior and economic types. They've done incredible work over the past few years. They say that international tax havens are costing countries well over $10 trillion worldwide and leaving small and medium-sized businesses to pick up the slack. The OECD's number is of the same order of magnitude. When a dishonest few are allowed to game the system, leaving middle-class families and small businesses to foot the bill, it is up to governments to act. And a new democratic government would do just that, working aggressively with our G20 partners to make sure that everyone plays by the same rules. Since 2008, political and economic watchers the world over have come to learn about the stability and strength of the Canadian banking system. What is far less understood is that the strength of Canada's financial system today is built on much of our values as it is on our expertise. Canada was not immune to the siren call of financial deregulation that swept across the rest of the developed world just over a decade ago. In the 1990s, Canada's Liberal and Conservative parties alike joined the chorus. It was only New Democrats who consistently argued that we hold the anchor tight against the calls for radical deregulation. Today, Canadians are thankful we did. Canada's financial industry provides ample opportunity for ambition and for profit. It provides significant incentives to attract the best and the brightest of our society as to that sector as a profession. But what a system does not allow is for the narrow self-interest of a few to trump the larger interests of all Canadians. It does not sacrifice stability for the sake of promoting voracity. Now, 5 years separated from the global economic crisis of 2008, Canadians are once again bracing for economic threats from abroad. The threat of financial instability in Europe, the threat of political gridlock right here in Washington, the effect of U.S. sequestration cuts that have recently come into effect, combined with an end of various tax breaks 2 months earlier, are already affecting the American economy and Canada's as well. Consider the effect that cuts to border services are having on your economy in the Northeast and Midwest. Now imagine if instead of your exports crossing that border constituting 4% of your gross domestic product, as they do, they comprised 23% of your gross domestic product, as they do for us in Canada. You can understand our concern. The United States faces a serious long-term budget challenge. That can't be denied. But the arbitrary austerity of sequestration is not a solution to that challenge or to any other. You can't austere your way out of a crisis. Neither are the gridlock and brinksmanship that have gripped your capital. At its heart, the pursuit of public life must be the pursuit of public interest, of good government. Our country, much like yours, faces record levels of voter disengagement and frustration. All across Canada, I meet people who are committed to their communities but turned off by politics. A figure that might startle you, in our most recent general federal election, 2011, fully 2/3, 65% of young people aged 18 to 25 did not vote. That's an indication of a profound problem, and we're starting to address it. We elected a lot of very young MPs in that election, in the NDP. We've been sending them out across Canada to engage on the colleges campuses and on the university campuses across the country to talk about the change that they can get. People are turned off by the cynicism and the game playing, by the antics that they see in Parliament, and to be blunt, it's difficult to blame them. But in that federal election that I just described, something special happened. From coast to coast to coast, Canadians began to rediscover their voice in our democracy. They didn't just embrace the positive and optimistic vision put forth by the new Democratic Party, they saw themselves as part of it. Nowhere was this more true than in my home province of Quebec, where millions of voters made history by delivering a resounding no to the politics of division that had weighed us down for so long. I'll give you an interesting example of that. During the middle of that election campaign, the Conservative government offered loan guarantees for a large hydroelectric development in Labrador called Muskrat Falls, and it's in the lower part of the Churchill River and Gull Island. Massive project. In my home province of Quebec, there was an uproar against it. There were even resolutions unanimously condemning it, the loan guarantees, saying that Hydro-Quebec had not had the same advantage. Our approach was to say, well, find out what the criteria are, and next time you have a project, get the same thing. But you can't preach in favor of green renewables one day and then be against them the next day because it's in your neighbor's backyard. That hydro, by the way, was going to be set to displace heavy oil that was being burned and coal that was being burned, both in Newfoundland, Labrador, and Nova Scotia, and indeed in New Brunswick. So it was a good project. And we were told that, I was the only seat in Quebec at the time, that forget about it, you can't be in favor of this. And you know what? Quebecers gave us a huge mandate. They supported us because they believed that these were important issues. Quebecers have always taken that sort of forward-looking view themselves. They didn't listen to those who were criticizing us for supporting those loan guarantees. And we're going to continue doing exactly the same thing on other big energy projects, talking straight to people about the need to protect future generations, their right to have the same thing that we've had. We will become, if we continue this way, the first generation in Canadian history to leave less to the next generation than what we ourselves receive. We find that totally unacceptable. So even as we in North America struggle with the fallout of the deepest economic crisis since the Great Depression, the rest of the world hasn't stopped rotating on its axis. Whether it's activists fighting for the rule of law and respect for human rights in China, or young people demanding accountability from their governments in Eastern Europe, or an entire generation awakening in the Middle East, the struggle continues against challenges far greater than what we face here at home. The actions of great countries, such as ours, will shape the next century just as they did the last. Will we act out of fear or mistrust and risk deepening that division? Will we sit idly by and allow emerging democracies to flounder? Will we shrink from the challenges that stand before us, or will we rise to the occasion? As President Wilson understood, we can't separate our most fundamental interests from our most deeply held beliefs. Democracy, human rights, and social justice are not the luxuries of the powerful. They are the values upon which our power is built. In the last century, our two countries served as a model of partnership and progress for a waiting world. We built that partnership on the strength of these values. In the 21st century, as we prepare ourselves for an increasingly complex set of challenges, let's recommit to those same values and to those who share them. When we look out onto a horizon filled with uncertainty, it's those most familiar and most ardent principles that will guide us. And that will allow us to continue to overcome even more daunting hurdles. As I was walking this morning, I found a series of plaques to different people who have accomplished a lot here in American life, and one of them that I've always admired a great deal is the person I consider to be, for all intents and purposes, the founder of the modern environmental movement, Rachel Carson. And here it is, the quote that they had in her plaque. It's, "We are challenged as mankind has never been challenged before, to prove our maturity and our mastery, not of nature, but of ourselves." On that, I thank you, and I'm now open for your questions.
What we will propose to do, sir, and thank you very, very much for so many thought-provoking points that you made this morning, and there's more than enough. We could have you here all day to talk about any number of them in some detail, but I'd like to just start with a couple of questions, and then we're going to open up the discussion for further questions, and then after that, at the conclusion of our session, then Mr. Mulcair will be meeting with the media separately at the end of that. So the questions will be from the tables, and when you are acknowledged, would you please identify yourself and your group affiliation or business affiliation. But first, sir, if I may, when we talk about sustainability and sustainable economy, both in North America and abroad, it seems to many of us that we are at a particularly disputatious period, both in Ottawa politically and in Washington. I think it's all too evident for the folks here. And it therefore diverts many lawmakers from some of those very important issues that are reflected abroad, whether it's emerging nations, change and significant transition in government. But as you do look abroad, what is Canada's credibility, and how effective an actor is it abroad as part of that overall effort that you suggest we must all be making at this time?
The Canada that the Conservatives are projecting onto the world stage is no longer recognizable to a lot of the countries we've worked with closely over the decades, and it's no longer recognizable to ourselves. Bellicose, adamantly fighting any serious attempt to deal with the issue of climate change, withdrawing us from Kyoto, lecturing at the United Nations, calling them a bunch of dictators, hectoring. It's not productive. It's a way to appease your strong right-wing base, but it's not a way to move the world forward. Canada has a proud history as a peacemaker. We all look at situations like the millions of people who have left or are leaving Syria right now and realize that the world can and should be doing more. Canada is not stepping up to the plate in issues like that. So we do think that we can be doing a lot more on the big issues before us, like dealing with the sustainability. And if we have a 2, 3, 4 degree centigrade increase in world temperature over the next century, we're going to be wreaking havoc on the ability of all species, including ours, to continue to live in this environment. We've never had any trouble understanding that we could impose on our trading partners certain minimum rules with regard to other human rights. Even though it's not perfect, we theoretically, because some people are actually indentured as they're picking the cotton that goes into the clothes that you wind up buying on High Street. But generally speaking, there's nobody in the world that sees strong rules against child labor or slave labor as being anything what they are, rules that reflect fundamental values, and they can be used as barriers in international trade. I put it to you that in the next 25 years, the #1 issue in international trade will be environmental, whether or not we can impose minimum standards, whether it's something very objective and measurable like pesticides, or something that requires a more complex assessment, like whether or not the other country is applying basic rules of sustainable development, is involved in the world in trying to reduce greenhouse gases that are threatening life on this planet. So that is something that we're going to have to look at carefully, all of us, in the years to come. Canada can and should be playing a leading role. We are physically located in such a way that we're feeling the effects very immediately on the polar ice cap, for example. Another great source of greenhouse gases is the loss of the permafrost, which contains and holds a lot of methane. That's 22 times worse than CO2 as a greenhouse gas. So these are big drivers in global warming right now. We should all be very concerned about it, and we can be acting on it if we believe in it. If we're told that that's just rubbish that's being made up to scare people, and it's to raise money for the environmental groups, which is what the Conservatives affirm, then we won't start working on it. But it's a real problem and one that we have to start addressing.
Thank you, sir. The issue of cybersecurity is an issue that's discussed in different forums almost every day in this town. You're going to be meeting, and we'll spend some time with a variety of Americans during your stay in Washington. What could you say about initiatives Canada is taking or should be taking, both from a national interest perspective as well as from a global perspective in terms of
We already have met with several people in the U.S. government, some officials from the White House, in fact. And one of the issues on the table, from our point of view, had to be cybersecurity. It's of great concern to us. I mentioned the physical border that we also have to take care of. But there have been increasing indications on the Canadian side that we have been the object of cyber attacks from China. You've had the same indications here. So we've got to become mature about it, develop the techniques and the ability to deal with it, and be lucid about the fact that it's being done. An attack of that nature is no less an attack for having been done digitally.
With respect to the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations and Canada's, I think, late phase now, negotiations with the European Union on a trade agreement, I would add that, again, here there's a sense of uncertainty, not quite insecurity, but uncertainty about the negotiations underway for the TPP. Now, Canada will be participating for the first time in the meetings in Singapore a few days from now. What can you say about Canada's stance with respect to the overall negotiations, and what would you, as leader of the opposition, hope that Canada will achieve through those negotiations?
I'll start with the second one, the CETA, this comprehensive European trade agreement that we're working on. When I describe the inequalities in the approach that we're taking in the deal that we mistakenly, I believe, signed with China, we can't say the same thing about the European Union. I mean, we're dealing on an even playing field. We're dealing mostly, for the most part, with countries that have very high standards when it comes to their labor laws, very high standards when it comes to their environmental norms. So, and the rule of law and an independent court system and traditions in that regard. So that's the objective reality of the start of this. I have to say that in Canada, in the past few months, I have met an equal number of people who are ferociously opposed to this trade deal, who have never read it, as I have met people who are adamantly in favor of this trade deal who have never read it. So I can be forgiven for wearing my name well, Thomas, and saying I want to touch the thing, I actually want to see it. We're going to look at the exact wording of things like investor state provisions. Those are going to be important. After the NAFTA, Canada realized that maybe the way it had been drafted had not been allowing us enough latitude to have rules regarding public protection. 2,4-D is a good example. A pesticide that we had banned in Quebec, challenged under the NAFTA by Dow. It was basically a push. Everyone walked away with what they needed after the litigation. But that being said, nation states and other jurisdictions on a subnational level who have responsibility for these issues have to be able to edict rules in the public interest and public protection, as long as it's transparently in the public interest and not a disguised way of protecting markets. And the NAFTA gave some good models on that. We don't think about this part as much, but free trade and professional services under the NAFTA is something that's actually been very productive and positive between the two countries, and it's had a salutary effect within the countries to start breaking down long-held state-by-state, province-to-province barriers. So if you look at these things objectively, they can produce a good result, but we're going to be watching that sort of thing very carefully. There are others that people have talked about, like the cost of prescription drugs. It's a problem because you don't want individuals to be stuck with that, but governments can move in on that and start compensating if you give better protection to get up to the world level, which Canada probably would be offering in that one. On the TPP, that's a bit of a complicated one for us. One of the things we're going to be keeping our eye specifically on is what's called la gestion de l'offre in French, supply management in English. It's a technique that we have in Canada, quite different from the States, where you have a lot of direct subsidies. So if somebody goes to Minneapolis and looks at the price of a gallon of milk and compares it to an imperial gallon on the Manitoba side of the border, might say, well, one is a lot cheaper than the other, but the American one's heavily subsidized before it gets to the store shelf. The Canadian one is the object of this system that we think has produced good results. You know, we've got lots of families in Ontario and Quebec that are not just in their third or fourth generation. On the Quebec side, we've got a lot of people who are in their third and fourth century on the same land. So they've been able, by and large, despite the ups and downs of the economy and the cyclical nature of the economy, to hold on to their farms and not see them be brought up by big aggregators and conglomerates. We think that that's a good thing. The Australians and the New Zealanders have largely gotten rid of subsidies in agriculture. They're saying, we want part of that market. So there's going to be a lot of pressure on Canada in that one, on that one. Overall, again, we're going to have to look at the countries that we're dealing with. We in the NDP honestly believe that you are allowed to look at people's records on things like human rights and the environment and before you sign that sort of deal, because it's a reflection of who you are, who you deal with on this sort of thing. And I think that we're allowed to challenge those issues as we sign these deals.
Thank you, sir. And one last point deals with a House subcommittee hearing tomorrow, a subcommittee of the larger Foreign Affairs Committee. And the subcommittee is going to look at the Western Hemisphere and how enhancing partnerships with Canada and with Mexico would enhance U.S. energy security. If you were invited to speak before that subcommittee tomorrow, what one or two key points would you like to communicate to that subcommittee on
well,
that
there are
theme?
a lot of challenges, and some of them are structural and quite easy to deal with. For example, right now between Canada and the United States, business groups have been pushing for a long time for harmonizing the very simple rules that surround the manufacture of a lot of consumer products. There's not really that much difference, but there's enough of a difference to make it really difficult. For no valid reason. So if Europe has been able to work across the boundaries of 27 different nation states and come to rules on this sort of thing, I think that that's a little bit the model for the future. I've been prudent because I've been invited by lots of people over the past few days to give lessons to this side as to what to do for their energy security. I'll tell you what I would do for Canada. As the leader of Her Majesty's Loyal Opposition and a government in waiting, I would make sure that we took care of our energy security, something the current government's not doing, because whatever else happens with global warming, we will have to heat our houses and run our factories. I would move petroleum products as a priority from west to east, get it to tidewater quickly there. There's existing trackways. I don't know if we could actually use the existing lines. There's some thought of reversing some lines, but the lack of a credible, thorough environmental review process means that there's no longer a social license, even if you get your regulatory license. So there are a lot of people who will be looking askance at that. I think it's a win-win-win in Canada if we were to do that first and foremost. We would be getting a better price for the producers and therefore better royalties for the producing provinces. You know, some of them are having quite a bit of budgetary problems this year because of the fact that they had underestimated the hit that some of those commodity prices were going to have. We'd be getting more Canadian jobs. The key pipeline that's on the table right now would represent the export of 40,000 Canadian jobs. We think that we should be, as a priority, like any nation state, looking to create jobs in our own country based on our own raw natural resources. That's called value added. It's a basic principle that everybody should be looking at. And of course, we'd be getting a better energy security that we're not looking at right now. In the East, in Toronto and Montreal, we're paying the full Brent crude price right now. We're not even getting the West Texas Intermediate price anymore, the WTI. We're getting something new that they call Western Canada Select as it moves down to the States, which is a far lower price. The irony of it is, 2 days ago, the U.S. government approved an export license for Valero to leave the Gulf of Mexico and bring crude to the Gulf of St. Lawrence and all the way down to Quebec City to feed the Saint Romuald refinery. That, in a nutshell, is what's wrong with this picture. So I think that as a Canadian, that's what I would be putting my emphasis on. I'm sure that Americans are going to be looking after their own interests as I'd be looking to take care of ours.
Thank you, sir. Now, we open the floor to questions, please. First question. Yes, at the end of the table. Ah, there you are, Marianne.
Good morning. I'm Marianne Rood. I'm the province of Manitoba's representative here in Washington. So I first want to say welcome. I'm wondering if you wanted to comment about the effort underway by some of Canada's premiers, Premier Selinger being one, to develop a Canadian energy strategy.
The idea is a good one. And as I pointed out in my remarks earlier, control of natural resources is provincial under our federation's rules. So we'd have to be working with the provinces and territories. We could give an impetus to it. I gave a hint before when I talked about Gull Island and the other hydro developments in Newfoundland, Labrador, something that we're in favor of. But it's going to be up to the province of Newfoundland, Labrador to decide whether the economic conditions are right, whether that's something that they want to proceed. That's their decision. The federal government, of course, would have to do its environmental assessments, but as I also pointed out on these large projects, for all intents and purposes, that legislation has all been gutted. They've gone so far as to arrogate to Cabinet the right to overrule anything in an environmental assessment that they don't agree with. Again, that sort of bulldozing gets a big thumbs up from companies that are not thinking long term. The ones that are realizing what they've been given understand that it's a poison chalice, to use the image I used before. The provinces coming together would require, of course, given the fact that there is an interprovincial aspect, transboundary aspect, the federal government's presence would be very helpful. Our preference would be to have the federal government involved in developing a system of green renewable energy across the country, working with the provinces and territories. You know, in the province of Quebec right now, we've got about 40,000 megs, so 40,000 million watts of hydro, but that's backed up now by 4,000 megs, 4,000 times a million watts of energy that's produced by the wind. That's interesting because that's a backup. In 150 years of using electricity, the one thing we've never really figured out how to do is to store it. So you can put that in tandem with the hydro dams where you can store the potential energy, and it's a great system. And we can repeat that. We've got an ideal climate for geothermal. We can be going after that. When I was in Saskatchewan last weekend, I was in Saskatoon, I saw a company that's doing incredible work on solar. So they're forward-looking companies that understand that there are abilities to get at this. We've just got to get over our old Canadian habit of getting to our natural resources as quickly as possible and exporting them in as raw a form as possible. In Quebec, we banned years ago the export of raw logs, and we developed a furniture industry. Who knew? I mean, that's the idea, right? And that's the image. Some provinces still export raw logs. We don't think that that's a really good idea in terms of the sustainability on the social side. You're not creating the jobs at home.
Yes, to the left over here.
Monsieur Mulcair, my name is Sean Kennedy with the Lexington Institute. Thank you, first of all. I think all Americans are very interested to hear from Her Majesty's opposition. But I wanted to ask a question, actually, where politics intersects policy from the United States point of view. Your party came into power unexpectly with strength in Quebec.
I wish we were in power.
We're the official
opposition.
The official opposition, obviously, superseding the Grits. And in your position, with an overwhelming percentage of your caucus from the province of Quebec, the question of federalism and separatism is always at top of mind. With the floor crossing the other day and the Clarity Act, how can you assure Americans that when in government, the New Democratic Party, with a strength in Quebec, would be, one, stable, and two, would be a federalist party?
Well, the fact of the matter is that for the first time in a generation, Quebecers voted for a federalist party, the NDP, and gave us their confidence. You're right. One member of our 58-member caucus left because he thought that we weren't sovereignist enough. I guess he was mistaken, because I sat down with him and Jack Layton sat down with him, and we went through our constitutional position in great detail. Let me talk to you a little bit about what it is. It's called the Sherbrooke Declaration, and it's a way of putting an end to decades of provocation by some of the older parties who used to love to stir up the nest in Quebec. Better to turn to the rest of Canada and say, oh, you see the way they're behaving? You better put us in power. Mr. Harper even mused, when he was in opposition, about building a firewall around Alberta. My whole career has been about building bridges, not building firewalls. My personal background, French on one side, Irish, Anglo on the other, has made me understand both sides. My professional career has brought me to work as much at the Conseil de la Langue Française as at Alliance Quebec, the English rights group in Quebec. I'm going to continue to do that. That's what attracted people to the NDP under Jack. That was something that we worked on together, and that was the political offer we put on the table. An optimistic, positive, forward-looking view that attracted Quebecers to us. So I'll let people use the type of language that you used. I don't know the Lexington Institute. I'd love to learn more about you, but I can only tell you this. For the first time in a generation, Quebecers have had confidence in a Federalist Party, have run on that, and when the vote came, where we had lost the one guy who left, because he found that we were too Federalist, every single member of our caucus stood up and voted for our position. We have a law on the table that's clear with Canadians 2.5 years out from the next election. There'll be no surprises on that. And it essentially says what, that law? It says that you're going to have a clear question. We give examples of what a clear question would be if you ever want to start discussions on any constitutional change, including secession. We open the door for positive constitutional change. We can also open the door for positive administrative change without the whole rigmarole of Meach and Charlottetown, these big divisive things that we went through in the past. And I'll give you a concrete example we said in our legislation. It's been a long-standing view in Quebec that the federal government should not be able to invade areas of exclusive provincial jurisdiction. Other provinces don't feel as strongly about it. Under the 1867 constitutional deal called the British North America Act, you'll not find anything about the federal government's right to intervene in provincial areas of jurisdiction. It's something invented by the Canadian Supreme Court. We don't find any problem in telling Quebecers that it's our view that Quebec should be allowed to withdraw with full compensation, without conditions, whenever the federal government sets up a program to invade an area of exclusive provincial jurisdiction. We think that that's healthy. Getting that sort of thing out on the table now, being able to discuss it. The advantage I have is whether I'm in Calgary or in Chicoutimi or in Washington, I say the same thing, and so does every member of our party. You're right, but you know what? The departure of that colleague opened up a much wider corridor for us. Canadians realize now that we are a Federalist Party standing strong in favor of Canada, but a better place for Quebec in Canada, winning conditions for Canada in Quebec. That's what we're all about.
Thank you. My name is Fazli Siddiq, and I'm a professor at Dalhousie University and a fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School. But this year, I'm the Canada-U.S. Relations Fulbright Professor, hosted by the Wilson Center. Thank you for your excellent remarks. And I guess my primary focus is on the many reservations that you have expressed about the current Conservative government led by Prime Minister Harper, and with regards to its international conduct, about which you also expressed very serious reservations. Could I ask you, sir, in what respects would an NDP-led government in Ottawa, with yourself as Prime Minister, have a different relationship with countries of the world, in the Middle East, in the Far East, and especially in our relationship with the United States? What are some of the most important elements where an NDP government would conduct itself differently from the current conservative government?
Well, I would start with the United Nations. It's still our best hope in the world. And if you don't work within the framework of international institutions that we've given ourselves to have the hope of moving forward in the world on the big issues like peace, like security, like getting drinking water to people in countries that don't have any. These are all things that we've done through international institutions. I didn't ask him to do it, but all you can do is look up John Baird's speech before the United Nations. You would never see a member of our government do something like that. It was an intentional slap in the face, a provocation, and it wasn't even accomplishing anything there. It was strictly done for their Reform Party base back home in Canada. Paul Dewar, who is our foreign affairs spokesperson, has been working hard on these issues. Hélène Laverdière, a career diplomat, another member of Parliament, she came in on the Orange Wave, and for our friend from the Lexington Institute, she's the one who defeated the head of the separatist Bloc Québécois in his riding. And so with people with their experience, we would make sure that Canada re-engaged on the world stage. The Canada that we could have been so proud of in the past, playing an active role in peacekeeping, being there when the world needed our experience, our expertise, and yes, our resources. To try to play that positive role. We've always been able to be an even-handed player on the world stage. On the Middle East, our position on one of the key Middle East issues, which is, of course, the Israel-Palestine issue, is for a two-state solution. We want a state for Israelis and a state for Palestinians within secure, mutually agreed, protected borders. We think that that's the way forward for the future. We'll always defend that. There's also a great opportunity in the Arab Spring countries, as we've watched, but we're quite concerned a couple of years out from that, that some of those might not be living up to the promise that strong reaction of the public had been allowed to create. So we're going to be very concerned on that. Around the world, we'd like to get back to a Canada that's perceived, because we would be an even-handed player capable of portraying ourselves and conducting ourselves in an even-handed manner, a fair arbiter of world affairs, and one whose conduct would be respected. When we signed Kyoto under a different government, a liberal government, we went on to have one of the worst records in the world on greenhouse gas production. So we sometimes in the past had the tendency to not behave as we would like to have had people believe we were behaving. Under the Conservatives, I think it's a tragedy, but at least it had the merit of being clear. They actually withdrew us from the Kyoto Protocol. Under an NDP government, we would respect all of our international obligations, and we would become a world leader on the key issue of climate change. We would help the world craft an agreement that would be a closed system. You know, there is an example of cap and trade that's actually worked wonderfully in the world, and it's the cap and trade system that Canada and the United States put together to come to grips with SO2, which was causing acid rain. It worked. We've proven it can work. We can use that model and bring it worldwide, and we have to start doing that, because the future of our kids, of our grandchildren, and our grandfather get to say that, but of the whole planet actually depends on it. I know that sounds overreaching, but we have to understand that in the simplest possible expression, that's what this discussion is about.
Thank you, sir. One last question here, please. David Bia. Oh, I thought you had the question. Excuse me. Yes. Nick.
Hi, I'm Nick Nanos. I'm with the Wilson Center, and I'm a researcher in Canada.
I've heard of you.
Yeah, I have two very short questions. First of all, let's go back. I know it was an offhand remark. Let's assume that you are Prime Minister leading a new democratic government in Canada. First question is, under the sustainable economy thrust that you've just been talking about, what would be your first piece of legislation? And second of all, in your first meeting with the President of the United States, what would be the first concrete thing you would try to do as the Prime Minister of Canada?
One of the first things that we would do would be to bring in overarching sustainable development legislation. One of the biggest problems we've had in Ottawa is we've never had a systematic approach. We've never had anything overarching. So some government agencies and departments did quite well when there was some sort of impetus in that direction. Now, overall, there's no interest in it. As the very recent report of Canada's Environment Commissioner showed, I mean, it's a disaster. They're not doing anything. They don't believe in it. They have no intention of doing anything about it. With regard to projects, I think that you had a pretty strong indication that for us it will be a priority, and this is not something that's done by snapping your fingers. It has to be done in close consultation with provinces and territories. Unlike Mr. Harper, we actually believe in consulting and working with the provinces and territories. He refuses, for those who don't know about it, but there's something called the Council of the Federation, and he refuses even to attend the meetings. So we would do it differently, but we do think that Canada has all the resources and the brain power to come up with a coast-to-coast system of green renewable energy, and we would do everything we could to make that a reality. On the front of dealing with our American colleagues, I would continue some of the great work that's being done now on the business side as we try to reduce barriers to transboundary mobility of persons and products. We think that that's in everyone's best interest if we can do it securely. There's a lot of discussion about a perimeter that would raise concerns with regard to our respective sovereignties, and we'd have to make sure that we followed that one very carefully. But overall, we would continue in a very close working relationship with our most important trading partner, but as I tried to insist on a lot during today's speech, also a partner that shares our most fundamental of values.
We had one question in the far right, I believe. Gentleman at the back.
I'm always worried about the questions from the far right.
He'll move quickly.
Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. Mon nom est Raphaël Guévan-Nicolov. Je suis un étudiant ici à la maîtrise en relations internationales à Johns Hopkins sur une bourse Fulbright. Pour le bénéfice de chacun de nos invités ici, je vais vous poser ma question en anglais. Bringing it back to President Fraser's question on trade agreements, you spoke very eloquently about the need to wed our trade interests to our values. We didn't speak so much about services, whether it's the healthcare sector, for example, or in science and technology. I would like to know if diploma recognition is part of the ongoing negotiations. And if so, is Canada able to deliver in terms of diploma recognition, considering our federalist Constitution?
Merci beaucoup de la question, Raphaël, et félicitations d'être un boursier Fulbright. Ça rejaillit positivement sur nous tous. What a great question. When I was the president of the Office des Professions du Québec, which is a regulatory agency that sits atop all of the self-governing professional bodies in the province, so it's a light regulatory structure that has one mandate to make sure that they're doing their job of protecting the public. We were actually brought into the drafting of the free trade and services provisions of the NAFTA. And I alluded to in passing before when I said it helped bring down interprovincial and interstate boundaries, but it's worth remembering that in the United States, licensure, therefore professional licensing exams, is a subset of the state policing power. And we used to have a very arcane system here where you had to re-op, you had to re-qualify, recertify. If a nurse moved from state to state or a dentist tried to go from Oregon to California, you had to rewrite your exams as if dentition changed from Oregon to California. So that type of pressure by the NAFTA saying, well, we have to have only objective rules that are actually about protecting the public and the consumer, that's had a good effect on removing some artificial barriers. It used to be that if you wanted to practice pharmacy in the state of Florida, you had to have been physically seated in Florida when you wrote the licensing exam. So if someone had written the identical exam in another state, they couldn't qualify to practice in Florida. A rule like that had everything to do with protecting the market of pharmacists in Florida and absolutely nothing to do with the protection of the public. So these are big issues, writ large. And I would add one thing. According to Statistics Canada, the #1 cause of poverty amongst immigrants is failure to recognize their professional credentials. And that's something that we have a state obligation to work on. So it's not enough to say, well, we've got this system now and then leave people alone. You have to actively make sure that the residency requirement can be met because there's a residency available. There was one case of one profession that wanted people to write an exam that was going to cost $7,000 to write the exam. So you have to remove that sort of physical barrier, but it's a winner overall. And it's because the provinces and the states have always had this very balkanized division that there was no reflex to think that this was possible. You know, you just sort of affirmed that, well, Canadian architects obviously don't know enough about earthquakes, or American architects don't know enough about snow loads. Well, actually, it's not very hard. And once you've got all the rest of your professional qualification, you can still double-check the program itself and make sure that people are okay. One of the things, as Europe was brought together, from the ashes of the Second World War, people like Jean Monnet, like Konrad Adenauer, had a vision that they could bring people together. So at first it was around a coal and steel community, and then it became a common market. And, you know, with all its attendant challenges about, you know, butter mountains and milk lakes as they tried to get a common agricultural policy, and that morphed into, you know, a European economic community, and then still further into a European Union. Today it's still imperfect, but it's that vision, that drive, that from day one saw them say, well, if we're going to do this, you know, there's really no reason to say that an Italian dentist can't practice in Britain. And so you've always had that approach to say, if there's no need for a barrier, don't have it. Well, it's the same thing. We can't use public protection as an excuse. It has to be a goal. And if it's an objective goal and it's transparently in that interest, you maintain your right to have a rule in that direction. But other than that, you have to be working. The greater mobility is a good thing for people. It's a good thing for both economies. And your examples were particularly well chosen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir.
Bien, merci. Thank you.
Personal thank you to Mr. Mulcair for being with us today. He exemplified what previous public policy leaders have brought to the table here at the Canada Institute of the Woodrow Wilson Centre. Thank you very much, sir. We wish you much continued success in your public policy leadership in Canada and in contributing to the dialogue on not only Canada-U.S. relations but global affairs as well. This now concludes our discussion. Thank you all very much for being with us today, and we wish you all a good day. Thank you. They'll come into the well here so that you can.
We wanted to have you with them as opposed to on the other side of the table.